مساء الخير جميعا، أهلا وسهلا فيكم في هذا اللقاء اللي نتشرف فيه من الصديق سلمى شعبان. لقاءنا اليوم راح يكون بالإنجليزي، فراح أقدم ضيفتنا بالإنجليزي بس بعد قليل. بس خلوني أول أنوه إنه هذا هو اللقاء الافتتاحي من برنامج أو هذا الفصل من برنامج السينماتيك، واللي هو تحت عنوان تحولات السينما جنوبا. راح يستتبع هذا اللقاء بشهر 4 بعد رمضان إن شاء الله حلقة دراسية راح تسويها سلمى، وبرامج أخرى راح نعلمكم عليها. رمضان كريم عليكم جميعا. Hello everyone and thank you for coming. It's a pleasure to have you with us today, and it's really our pleasure to introduce Səlmə Şaban. Out of pleasure and really out of interest, to inaugurate this second part of the Cinematheque program, Cinematic Transformations from the Global South. We live in a time saturated with images. They circulate at speeds that collapse distances. They travel across borders, across languages, across screens. And yet with that kind of remains really a profoundly Western discourse around images and their nature. And so I think when Səlmə Şaban comes today with kind of this question, how is it that we experience images today? But kind of through really drawing on her extensive kind of research that has taken her to different contexts across the Global South, I think this question is really a very timely one, and one that is of profound urgency. For that, and also for, I think, another reason, that over the last 3 years, we have, witnessed images, that left us not necessarily only asking what it is that we are seeing, but who are we in front of those images. And I think that's, this remains really an urgent question at this kind of moment in time. So, Səlmə will definitely introduce the topic for today, I think, in a way that I definitely can't, and I'm really excited and interested to hear more from you. But I just want to say but allow me just to kind of formally introduce Səlmə for those of you who don't know her. Səlmə Şaban is a film curator and researcher whose work focuses on anti-colonial film movements and on experimental approaches to creating liberatory moving image practices. Most recently, she completed a Watson Fellowship where she researched and trained in film archiving practices across multiple countries in the Global South. Her work includes curating film programs and delivering talks in cities such as Philadelphia, Beirut, Tunis, Dar es Salaam, and Bangkok. She graduated from college in 2024 with a double major in philosophy and Islamic studies, and she is currently based in Amman. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, Səlmə. And we look forward kind of to hearing you speak, and we will then open the conversation with the audience.
In the 1997 film, A Plate of Sardines, Omar Amiralai tells Muhammad Malas that the first time he visually encountered Quneitra, a Syrian town Israel destroyed, was through Malas's film, Quneitra 74. And the first time he went there was when working with Malas on his film, The Night. In response, Malas tells him, Omar, I wish you'd known the city not just through cinema, but by actually being there. I wish you could smell the air of Quneitra, which always creates a feeling of life. Malas says this while they are sitting together in Quneitra. It becomes clear that the Quneitra Malas describes is not a place, it is a time. And yet, cinema and its ability to preserve a particular time cannot compensate for his destroyed city. Instead, cinema and images become a painful encounter with the time that no longer is, and with the place that no images can recover. If experiencing Quneitra gives one a feeling of life, perhaps its images leave us with a feeling of death. Existing under the shadows and histories of occupation, what do we do in the remains of place? What do we do in the remains of time? When facing systematic efforts of destruction and ethnic cleansing, perhaps the natural response becomes to preserve. When the Zionist threat is the old will die and the young will forget, our duty as the young becomes to not forget and instead to remember. Stories from older generations about revolutionary passion and pain are delivered with so much nostalgia that the stories become part of the past. And so, to fulfill the duty of belonging in exile becomes to remember this past that has no place in the present besides nostalgia and memory. With the relationship to Palestine assigned to memory, we can work towards futures defined by new values, where a good life and a good job does not necessarily entail a liberated Palestine at all. If anything, a good life would avoid any such mention, since it would risk this pragmatic model of success, and worse, it would deeply disturb it. Perhaps it was through this disturbance that I questioned if there is something cinema and images can recover that memory cannot. I questioned this after watching Palestinian films from the 1970s on my laptop and experiencing them as excitingly and almost overwhelmingly present. I did not experience the 70s or the periods and places labeled revolutionary, but for the first time, it seemed that I could situate my present through lenses molded by lineages of Palestinian and Third Worldist revolutions, revolutions that transcend and transgress the borders of historical periodization. And so, when I learned that Israel stole Palestinian film archives in its invasion of Lebanon in the 1980s, it felt personal, even though I learned about it in retrospect. I became interested in film archives and their possibilities of not only resisting erasure, but of opening up new possibilities to interpreting the world and to experiencing our time and place within it. I received a 12-month research fellowship called the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship that allowed me to pursue an independently designed project through travel, and I undertook a project on film archiving practices in formerly colonized countries. Everywhere, I was surrounded by people filled with the urgency that we must find new ways of seeing where the past is not foreign and the future is not doomed, ways of seeing that are mobilizing and liberatory. While preparing this talk, I was wondering if I should begin from the start of the fellowship in August 2024 and draw a timeline until the end of the fellowship in August 2025. I returned to my journals and to the pictures I have taken in order, but I do not recognize them entirely. The handwriting is mine, and the stories and thoughts described did indeed happen to me, and the images are all taken from my perspective. But how I was moved to choose specific words or take specific pictures becomes a kind of guessing game, with any answer being a possibility. I wonder if our time is a straight line that moves like a plane, only marking its previous trail briefly before evaporating into an otherwise clear sky. It is the same logic of time the newscast offers. One event with its headlines and images replace the last, and time moves in a straight line with no final destination. And so, what do we do when we do not necessarily recognize the past, but we recognize the present for being all too familiar, for seemingly having been here before, maybe in the past, maybe in a dream, maybe in another person's story? What happens when the same planes come back to the point that they are recognized from sound? A linear model of time becomes untenable. It becomes an imposition on a reality that operates according to different logics. The logic of a linear model is not random, but is formed through histories of power, where we must move in a direction of progress to catch up to developed countries that are further down along a timeline they made, and that yesterday's murders and bombs from said developed countries will not necessarily repeat. It becomes an existential necessity to free ourselves from these logics of time, to interpret the world more meaningfully, and to create new frameworks of vision that, as Fanon writes, open up new, unlimited horizons. Images, being forms that carry the past but are always experienced as being present, become an intriguing avenue to rethink our relationship to time. During my time training at film archives, we worked with film reels as physical objects that literally carry time, in that the heavier a film reel, the longer in duration it is, and also as objects that deteriorate over time. To preserve a film, reels have to be stored at specific temperatures without humidity until the time comes that they are picked from the shelf to be restored and digitized. To restore a film, we put a film on a film widening table with one roll on one side and an empty core on the other side. We then wind the film so that the entire roll is eventually transferred to the new core while checking to see if the film has any damage. There could be rips in the reel that need to be taped, objects or hair stuck that would need to be cleaned so that the reel can go in the digitizing machine or projector without ripping. This is a reel that has of a cartoon and the middle part is damaged. We would then go through the reel again, reversing it, stopping it at different times, making note of different particularities. To restore time, we had to revoke its linearity, start it and stop it, reverse it, change its speed of movement. Mesmerized, time never appeared so physically. This is a cross-dissolve or cross-fade, how it would look on film. When a film reel has decayed, we slow down the scanning machine so it does not rip. When the film is in good condition, we watch its movements in silence. While sitting with a film inspector and a good friend from the Time Film Archive, we watched a film reel swim through the winding paths of wheels as it spins off its original core and onto a new core. And she tells me, when I look at the film reel finishing, I think of my life ending. I look from her back to the gradually shrinking circle of film reel, and I see how she sees it. Then I see it myself. Then I think of the movie fantasy, that your entire life will flash before your eyes at the moment of death, as a series of consecutive images from birth to those final seconds. And not only do I understand it, but I see it. For the film, which is about to die, as we watch it and talk about what kinds of Thai foods I have tried. We will then take this film and send it to be scanned and digitized, and the film will then be born and die again countless times beyond our knowledge. I almost felt sorry for the film, this physical body in front of us that starts, ends, and ages just like us. Over the course of the fellowship, particularly when I was unsure whether or not to take a picture of something, I wondered if the desire to take pictures or the desire to preserve was fueled by an inability to confront death and the inevitable passing of time. In a conversation with an 80-year-old archivist of an environmental social movement group in Chile, he warned me that if I do not archive my personal things before I die, then someone will just throw them away because they will not see their importance. For a second, I wondered how much my personal belongings mattered if I were no longer here. And then it hit me. It is not about me at all. Like the roll of film, I will begin and end. But the hope is that what I have seen and how I have seen it can continue to communicate far beyond any individual self. Archiving, I learned, is a form of communication and experimentation with time, not fueled by a fear of death, but by the urgent need to make the personal collective, to realize a shared existence. I thought about our conversation as I restored a Chilean family's homemade film from the 1960s in the Chilean National Film Archive. And I wondered if the person who filmed their family ever imagined that I would be holding the film reel between my hands. Of course, they could not have imagined this, and until the very experience, neither could I. In moments of coincidence or chance, I do not meet the person filming, but far more intimately, I see what they see, I see how they see. The workday finishes, and I return the reel I worked on back to the shelf. I do not think about the reel again until, walking in a park, I see a man filming his family and the park around him, and I recognize the scene as familiar. So much so that I get emotional for reasons and connections I cannot yet draw. But I can rest knowing that when time moves so shapelessly, a future image or experience can materialize connections to a present where interpretation lacks. Personal memories can sometimes feel like secrets because when they are said out loud, they become stories, or when they are taken an image of, they become images. Stories and images revoke the individuality of experience because they are experienced outside their original time and place. When I was in Thailand training at the Thai Film Archive, I attended a screening of the 2024 film Small Hours of the Night by Singaporean director Daniel Huey. The film is based on a 1983 trial where an activist is killed and his brother is suspected of attempting to engrave his brother's final revolutionary poem on his tombstone. To make a film on this subject, Huey, the director, embarked on the journey of finding the brother, the subject of his film, in a variety of ways. But he was unable to reach him, and he eventually gave up. He carries on and conducts his research on him when all of a sudden, someone reaches out to Huey and says he can connect them. Finally, they meet, and Huey comes prepared with his questions. He asks his questions about particular events relating to the trial, but in response to many of them, the man, now old, says that he has forgotten the details. Explaining the story to us, Huey tells us, in a way, the story became more my story than his. Huey did not recover the past. He was not yet born when the trial happened, and yet he creates the past from fragments and shards of histories and narratives that were repressed and excluded from a national history to the point of personal forgetting. Stories, images, and even memories ripple and migrate across people and times, solidifying at moments of resonance and recognition, creating lineages that transcend familial or national borders. Daniel Huey's film was banned shortly before it was due to screen at the 2024 Singapore International Film Festival, setting into motion new passages of circulation. Images and experiences can always be beyond containment, especially when they do not fit into official narratives and archives. In many conversations I had while I was in Kenya and Tanzania, archives and preservation were words synonymous with colonialism. From local crafts stolen and confined behind glass in Western museums, to entire areas of land where people are forcibly displaced under the pretext of environmental conservation to facilitate safari tourism, preservation means extraction from a living context into the borders of definition for a colonial gaze. The museum, the archive, maps, postcards all emerge as colonial tools to violently define space and to institutionalize knowledge. Under the mask of expertise, the colonial power decides what is important and what is preserved. In a conversation with a Tanzanian filmmaker who followed two families in their journey to bring their ancestors' remains home from Germany, where over 20,000 stolen skulls and bones from former German colonies are kept, she tells me that Germany's reason for keeping them is always their expertise of preservation. When she visited the archive in Germany herself, she saw that the paper files were more well preserved and looked after than the human remains. I recognized the present as familiar when I was in Kenya, and I learned that Britain stole and destroyed archives documenting their brutal settler colonial rule. More specifically, in preparation for Kenya's independence, Britain undertook a secret operation called Operation Legacy, which was a coordinated effort to sanitize the archives. This is a picture from Operation Legacy, I'll read it now, which only came to light after surviving Mau Mau fighters who resisted British colonial rule raised a lawsuit on Britain in the 2000s for their policy of torture. It says, this is from Operation Legacy. As an alternative to fire, it is permissible to pack papers to be destroyed in well-weighted crates and sink them in deep and current-free water at the maximum practicable distance from shore. With many archives stolen or destroyed, and with image making under British rule prohibited, I was surprised to see archival footage of colonial rule in a screening of Mina Nanji and Zippy Kumundu's 2023 film, Our Land, Our Freedom. The filmmakers, after having to pay thousands and thousands to the British Archive to use footage, thousands and thousands to the British Archive to use the British propaganda films that have a booming British voiceover describing the scenes and describing the anti-colonial Mau Mau fighters as terrorists, do something very simple. They mute the films and they add voiceover from Mau Mau fighters and other survivors narrating what happened. And alas, not only do they exhibit the brutality of the British colonizers, but they exhibit the brutality of these very images being used as propaganda and justification. Colonial frames of interpretation disintegrate under colonized voices present and audible. The footage and the screening space are appropriated and subverted as the post-screening discussion erupts into resonances and desires to create new ways of engaging with history. The director announces a plan to create an online database with collected footage of elders who lived under colonial rule that can be accessed by anyone and can also be added to by anyone. As she says this, the audience of around 200 people, mostly in their 20s or 30s, burst into loud applause and cheers. The excitement is endless, as is history when archiving is not for defining and limiting, but for creating and expanding. Seeing this, I thought of Edward Said's 1984 essay, Permission to Narrate, as it played out so literally. Said writes, "Facts do not at all speak for themselves, but require a socially acceptable narrative to absorb, sustain, and circulate them." The same goes for the image. Images do not objectively translate reality, but are interpreted, circulated, and archived through frameworks of power. To discuss this in its daily encounters beyond the language of archiving, I will share an encounter I imagine everyone can relate to. An encounter with MBC Max. When I was in Tunis for 3 months, there was a restaurant called مطعم الاستقلال, or Independence Restaurant, in my neighborhood that I went to every Friday for lunch to eat their couscous special. One Friday, MBC Max was on the TV playing the 1999 American film Three Kings, a film where George Clooney, Mark Wahlberg, and Ice Cube act as 3 American soldiers who embark on a journey to steal gold in Kuwait in a visibly chaotic aftermath of the First Gulf War. But on their way, they meet a variety of struggling Iraqi civilians, so they commit themselves to saving them. And in turn, The Iraqis offer exaggerated reactions of gratitude and praise, like a scene where civilians kiss a soldier's boots. The movie came out in 1999, preceding the US's 2003 invasion of Iraq, or what they called Operation Iraqi Freedom, by 4 years. Leading up to the invasion, Dick Cheney and other American officials constantly used the language that American soldiers will be greeted as heroes. The film rehearses, frames, and materializes the savior fantasy for an international audience years before. And yet somehow, over 20 years later, we are encountering this film in a restaurant in Tunis, even after how the US's invasion actually played out, even after we encountered images from Abu Ghraib. The matter of the fact is, images are always maintained and redistributed over time. The question is who has the authority to do so and how? Perhaps one of the most absurd aspects of the experience was that the TV was on mute and we were all watching the movie by reading the Arabic subtitles. Looking at the Arabic subtitles, I began to wonder if they could be replaced with sentences not translated from English, but actually written in Arabic by someone from Iraq describing the scenes. George Clooney, Mark Wahlberg, and Ice Cube would never know. When I was in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, I learned about an incredible craft called film DJing that goes beyond this. Film DJing combines dubbing and commentary and exceeds it. I will show excerpts from a short film called Apostles of Cinema, which can be found online, the full thing, directed by Dara Emilia, Gertrude Melizana, Cici Malay, and Jesse Mpango, who are part of a collective called Ajabu Ajabu, and I recommend people check out.
Hii ni DJ ambaye anaika maneno ya Kiswahili. Hii ndo wahusika wenyewe. Hii ni jina la movie. Hii ni kama tunajipromote, yani mtu akitaka kutufollow Instagram pata kwa jina la Msomali World Movie. Kuna tamthilia tuseme mpya imetoka Kikorea au ya series ya Kizungu imetoka, mimi waga namlipa hela, nikimlipa yeye ananiingizia maneno ya Kiswahili, mimi naingiza soko. Ile inazo iko kitaka kama nimekuja lakini sio kuja kuiba. Naanza ni DJ. Nafanya kazi na DJ Black kwa sababu anakuwa anapendezea sana. Yaani anakuwa hadanganyi sana. DJ Black malizo for shizo ndimo mkatashomo mwenye vuku za kizombi. Anakuleta kwenye bunge la mashine hii wanaita Casino Lawyer. Moja kwa moja. Nyingi sana. Ni nyingi sana. Yaani kwenye 50,000 zinavuka. Yaani zinavuka kazi nyingi. Zina fan base kubwa. Msomali anaweza kanipa movie. Ila kama filamu sijaipenda wanamwambia hiyo mbaya siwezi kuifanya. Napenda filamu kali, alafu napenda filamu ngumu. Hayo ndio maisha yangu. Na kuna filamu moja ilitoka. Hiyo filamu nimetafsiri peke yangu duniani. Unataja filamu? Tenet. Ambayo mtoto wake Denzel Washington alipokuwa anaanza kucheza alipewa hiyo filamu. Ni Tenet. Hiyo. Bwana. Alichoshangaa ni kuona lile gari limekaa kwa mara nyingine. Hawa ni wale washenzi wanatengeneza ile mitambo ya sayansi kwa ajili ya future. Na kila DJ anaperform anavyoweza. Kila mtu ana yuko unique. Mwenyezi Mungu amemuumba kila mtu ana kitu chake. Lakini myself nitaongea mimi kama mimi. Hapo nitakuonyesha nilipokuwa jasiri. Na mimi nitakuonyesha ujasiri wa Mchina. Anapopigania alizia babake. Sawa? Twende sawa sasa. Unajua mimi napambana kwa sababu ya nini? Pesa. Pesa check kwa mzee. Ndio nilifanya mimi napambana hivi.
Everyone check out the full thing. I met DJ Black after watching the 2001 Tanzanian film Maangamizi, The Ancient One. The film had an international release but was hardly seen by people in Tanzania. And through DJ Black's reinterpretation and DJing of the film years later, the film comes alive again in cinema halls called bandas, where people discuss and react to the film in real time, energized by the possibilities of DJing and of responding to the film and to each other. I accompanied DJ Black to some of these cinema halls in his neighborhood, and never have I felt cinema be as alive. At every second, viewers experimented to create the film that was not simply being watched, but was being made through them. Through film distribution, DJing, and bandas, films made for generic universal audiences or for other audiences altogether become localized, sometimes hyper-localized, as their relevance and frameworks of perception are actively negotiated in collective spaces. Bandas and film DJing, appropriation of colonial archives like in Our Land, Our Freedom, and Daniel Huey's creation of a repressed past all demonstrate how fragile visual regimes are and how much room there is for creation and experimentation. When time is a space, as is the case with images, there is always potential for change. Perhaps it is to say, so long as we encounter images, we cannot be doomed. It is not all past, it is not all memory. We can appropriate, subvert, resist, and create the ways in which we engage with images and the ways in which we engage with time. I learned how fragile visual regimes are and how much they depend on our active participation in their logics to survive when I joined the activities of Masarib in Tunis, a group that organizes screenings for kids. They screened classics like Charlie Chaplin and Buster Keaton films, but the kids interpreted the films in ways I could have never imagined. In one screening, we watched Vittorio De Sica's 1951 film, Miracle in Milan, which ends with a scene where police and industrialists try to evict people from their informal living settlement, and instead, the people fly away on magic brooms, leaving the world of violence and greed behind them. I'll show you the scene. Let's see. To me, this scene was a magical ending and a materialization for a kind of fantasy of being able to fly away when fantasy erupts. It is almost a kind of rehearsal for the ultimate imagined salvation, for ascending to heaven. You can imagine our surprise when one of the kids says that he does not like the ending because they are leaving their land and they have to stay and fight like they do in Palestine. Other kids during the screening kept describing the police and the industrialists as occupiers who are creating an occupation. Through watching films with kids, visual tropes and habits of perception break down as they exhibit how much perception is molded over time and thus how much it can be changed and grounded in local interpretations. Together, we can energize our sense of sight and assert our agency to perceive. Before beginning the fellowship, I held the understanding I was taught, that the Hollywood blockbuster film is the one form of media the entire world shares. It is a kind of global colonial lineage, a universal culture we did not choose. And yes, I could go to a cinema and watch a Hollywood movie in any place I was. But that wasn't at all what pulsed through places and histories of colonial violence, exploitation, and repression. Instead, new lineages are actively being drawn, ones that are not based on imposition, but ones where the present is familiar and foreign places are recognizable. In every country and in every city and town, in streets, taxis, cinemas, restaurants, in the most symbolic of places and in the most mundane of places, I met people who reject letting images of Israel's genocide on Palestinians in Gaza slip into streams of image consumption. Everywhere, I met people who, filled with urgency, declare that they do not want to belong to a world that sees this as normal. Never did more seem at stake to break from a timeline where oppression is familiar in search of new material realities of liberation. What I learned from all these places and so many incredible people, people who welcomed me and extended so much warmth and generosity to me, is that we must resist imposed hegemonic frames that uphold violence and segregate the past from the present to deny our shared existence. And we must experiment to search for new frames. And then we must experiment again. It is an endless search through fragmentation and through the ever-changing possibilities of a time that is always moving. In my final month of the fellowship, I traveled to Phnom Penh in Cambodia to visit sites of genocide and to meet with archivists and filmmakers. Over the course of the fellowship, I made it a kind of mission to visit sites of violence and resistance, maybe out of a researching impulse to see how the past is physically curated into the present, and maybe out of the deep urgency to fill gaps in interpretation the genocide in Gaza has opened. I visited sites of the Cambodian genocide, particularly the killing fields and the S-21 prison, through booking a guided tour I was recommended. I got on a bus. I sat with other foreigners on seats that said "Happy Tour," as the tour guide started saying jokes, and after receiving few laughs, he told us we should not be emotional because we are researchers, not victims. It soon became clear that distance must be established for us to consume history. At the killing fields, we learn dates, the start date and the end date. We can take pictures. We can buy a flower to pay respect. We do not walk through the mass grave, as the sign says. We stop by the statue that reads, "Never will we forget the crimes committed during the democratic Kampuchea regime." And when we leave, we can buy a souvenir from the souvenir shop conveniently located on the way to the exit. When we went to the S-21 prison, we learned dates, the start date and the end date. We stop by the audio tour option, conveniently available in over 10 languages. We can take pictures. We stop by the statue that reads, "Never will we forget the crimes committed during the democratic Kampuchea regime." And when we leave, we can buy a souvenir from the souvenir shop conveniently located on the way to the exit. Before the tour ends, the tour guide reminds us that this is all in the past, and we should try to go to a specific street with a lot of tasty food vendors in the evening. The next day, I met with members of a Cambodian film collective called the Anti-Archive. A member tells me part of their name comes from a frustration with every event beginning with a preface that we must not forget, to the point that it loses meaning and becomes part of a procedure of events that fits in a timeline, where the genocide of over 1 million people over 4 years can somehow be archived in its totality to become part of the past and us part of the present. The relationship is one of memory, and the archive, with a capital A, is used to enforce how memory and experience should be accessed. The name Anti-Archive is not to go against archiving, at least from what I understood, but rather it is to criticize the habits of reducing events as past in order to distance ourselves in the present. As the filmmaker Davi Shu puts it, and I'm paraphrasing, it is about finding more truthful and meaningful ways of looking at the past in all its tensions and all its multiplicities to also be able to look meaningfully at the present. I do not know if I recognized it then, but I now recognize the conversation I had with members of the Anti-Archive Collective as familiar. With headlines and images from Gaza receiving fewer and fewer minutes in the news and on our phones, and with a so-called ceasefire into effect, we must ask ourselves what models of time we are holding on to. If we make the genocide part of the past, it creates enough distance from the present to carry on with business as usual. That is, until we encounter an image of genocide and we choose to accept it as familiar. When linear logics of colonial expansion and normalization mean the abrupt destruction and killing of Palestinian life, we must ask ourselves whose perceptions of the world linear time belongs to. I want to read excerpts from Isra El-Segali's article titled "Time Works Differently in Gaza," which was published in the Electronic Intifada on August 15, 2025, and more of her work can also be found here, and I recommend everyone read her work. She's a Palestinian journalist in Gaza. They say there is a time and place. My experience tells me you might find yourself living in a different kind of time simply because you exist in a different place. I studied Einstein's theory of relativity in school, but it never truly resonated with me. I never thought that this concept, filled with equations and laws I can barely recall now, would burst into my own life. But here in Gaza, time is relative. It doesn't simply pass, it rips through us. We might share the world's minutes and seconds, but the agonizing truth is we live these as years. And in the merciless blink of a few moments, your very existence is suddenly and starkly determined: martyr, injured, missing, or shattered witness. The actual time of any bombardment is seconds, but it creates hours, days, and years of pain. At 2:32 a.m., the civil defense put out the fire. At 20 minutes to 3, the crowd fell silent. The civil defense was still there, still transporting the injured and the martyrs. There was still shock and disbelief for those killed, injured, and lost. The pain lingered as those returning from aid distribution learned the fate of their loved ones. There was still an injured person waiting to be taken to hospital. There was still a martyr to be identified. 13 people were killed in the bombing on July 3. Dozens were wounded. Then another day came. Time moves differently in Gaza. As I am reading Isra's words, maybe images circulated from Gaza come to mind. The images we see, like archives, are fragments of reality and cannot frame the hours, days, and years of pain Isra describes. No images and no archives can restore the totalities and intimacies of the lives lost and the places destroyed. But through images, archival practices, and communicating with people in Gaza, we can search for meaningful ways of engaging with fragments of space and time for a genocide that was in the past, is in the present, and extends into the future. We must break from linearity and from oppressive frames of vision, again and again, in search for a free Palestine. I want to end where we began, in Quneitra, a place I know through the films of Muhammad Malas and Omar Amir Alai, a place that since 2024, Israel has occupied. After drifting through memories and films and the destroyed ruins of Quneitra, the film, A Plate of Sardines, ends resolutely in the present. In an infinite land of hills, fences and barbed wire separate two sisters. Facing these colonial logics, dividing space and time, the two sisters use microphones to ask each other about their lives.
that was really very expansive and very, very provocative. So much so that it's quite difficult for me to know actually where to start and where to open to the audience. And just maybe at the commentary level. I had a friend a while back who gave me an interpretation of the kind of Arabic word tanadul. And he actually he mentioned to me how interesting it is that there is this concept that we settle around something to agree on how we look at it and how we see it. Well, I think kind of the space that you're actually in right now is really, I think for me brought new resonances to that term. I want to start maybe from a central point. You reiterate that there's a background image, or not a background image, a background reference that constantly coming up, and it seems from occupation by also Ali. Can you just kind of give us a bit of why that was such a persistent term throughout, and why it held a presence and we got to replay it itself?
Thanks so much, Khalid. Yeah, the film was one of the main films that when I think about what got me into film archiving and these revolutionary films of the 1970s that really moved me was scenes of an occupation from Gaza. And the film, what makes it really so amazing was that the film was actually not made in Gaza at all. It was made in Lebanon by members of the Palestine Film Unit. So similar to what I was describing with Kenya under British settler colonial rule, it was completely, Gaza in the 70s was under complete military occupation, and there was complete prohibition from any image taking and image making. So what did the Palestinian filmmakers in Lebanon do? They were able to communicate with a French news team that was going to shoot a newsreel in Gaza. And they took that very same footage and completely appropriated it and made it into a revolutionary film that can be screened in refugee camps in Lebanon. And this was the first way that many people, Palestinian refugees, came to see Gaza for the first time in Lebanon. And what's so amazing, and I think is also what I'm talking about, the sort of temporal logics in the presentation, is that newscasts have a particular logic of time. It's this sort of linear time, and one thing replaces the last, and you sort just endlessly move in this, not even accumulation, but constant erasure. What this film does is it creates more of a circular narrative, where you begin in Gaza with a scene of what is happening, and you slowly begin to realize not a linearity of events, but a cycle of events, where violence and resistance continue to happen in cycles. And it's the same with many films. There's also a Zionist aggression, if people want to also check that out. Another film from the 70s that really plays on this idea of how can we see time not as this sort of constantly erasing things, but for cycles. And to sort of embrace this new logic of time where you can actually return to something in the future, which now I'm referencing. Walid Daqqa has a quote, and he says, "I do not want to return to Palestine." I'm paraphrasing. The mandate Palestine, British mandate Palestine, that's of nostalgia, because it's impossible to return there because you can't return in time. I want to return to the Palestine of the future. So it's this logic of can we use images as being objects that carry time to return not to the past for the sake of nostalgia or memory, but to return for the future, for the sake of resistance, for the sake of a larger Palestinian narrative of revolution and return. And just the last thing is also what's so amazing about this image, about this film, Scenes of an Occupation from Gaza, is it shows the extent to which experimentation is necessary for witnesses, people in exile, to be able to engage with these images. It's not a passive act of sort of we're just receiving images, but to really meaningfully engage with it. These images have to be taken, put into specific frameworks of power, which is how narratives, to go back to Saeed, and really given a sort of narrative of resistance. This is also another thing I'm pushing in this talk. Experimentation with images is a responsibility on us, and not just in its creation.
Mm-hmm. I mean, once again, I think I could lead on to that in multiple different ways. But maybe kind of I'll just take your last point, and this is a bit of a tougher question, but we often give our speakers kind of the right to not answer if they're not comfortable to that particular topic at a given moment. Yeah. But I mean, you mentioned kind of throughout the talk images, something along the side that kind of images circulating kind of social spheres to sustain them, that in order to understand facts, it's not enough to see the image, almost you need a social structure that is able to see them. And I think this is kind of to the extent to which you were just saying. And in the end, kind of, if we are able to see Mustafa Abu Ali's film without the experience of incubation, exile, wherever it is, and giving on the geography, that maybe the experience would hit differently. And you mentioned kind of an incredible example of a Tunisian man who, I imagine, probably watching the film also knew the facts, and this is my speculation. It's kind of, because we're talking now a lot about kind of the circulation of imagery, the circulation of footage from Gaza, and where does that leave this concept that we have that kind of to circulate an image outside of Gaza is enough for the truth to reach, which I think has really, this is really the discourse out, kind of this creation of awareness. I mean, do you have any reflections on it?
Yes. I think the discourse, especially, I mean, this is the heart of it. In terms of this idea that if only people could see, surely they would understand. It's this notion of that everyone sort of has decided that for war crimes to be proven, you need images as evidence. So what do you do in the case of Gaza, when there's not one image, not two, but this sort of thousands and thousands, I don't want to sort of make it into an abstract number. And I think this is also what Gaza is, this whole experience with image circulation has shown, is that it's really changed the medium of images itself. It's undermined this notion of image as evidence to reveal that this sort of global order of imperialism does not operate on evidence at all. It's instead that these images, if we want to sort of exit a colonial understanding of images, we also have to exit this understanding that these images are just evidence. Because clearly images are not necessary to prove war crimes. Or rather, they're dismissed when looking at war crimes. So it really, I think what it comes at is that images don't naturally matter or not matter on their own. It requires social engagement with images and structures of engagement with images to allow an image to matter. But this is also putting our agency into question. It's not, yalla, we have images and why isn't the world waking up? We have to create the ways of engaging with images, the methods of circulation, the methods of interpretation and making an image leave its place and time. How we will cultivate cultures of images is how we make an image matter, especially in this context.
I mean, and I think this is kind of really a recurrent, and what I really, I think, appreciated about this whole talk is that you're kind of, I think you're falling, you're kind of just short of just not kind of prescribing what that is, but almost trying to kind of describe to us the concept of what the archive means. I mean, you mentioned at some point that, archiving is a practice of expanding, it's of generation, kind of really flipping kind of that colonial construct of what it means to preserve, but that there is this much more kind of active construct that we're kind of looking, which I my understanding is not only kind of image based. I mean, it's not only about films. It's not, I mean, there's a social kind of sphere that you're talking about. I mean, even interestingly, in the end, you leave us with a text, not necessarily an image, which I think is something we can kind of get to. But maybe where does that, because you started this fellowship with, you know, restoring films, and where does that leave that kind of archiving practice? Yeah, there.
Yeah, I definitely, I think in the imagination when I was applying, it was like, I'm going to be working in film archives, cool. I'm going to be like touching films, like images are going to be objects. And these are all things that were very appealing to me. But also it reaches a point that, yeah, when I was working in countries in the global south, archives need so much funding, resources, specific skill sets that don't necessarily exist, but that does not mean that archiving doesn't exist. That does not mean that people will still find ways to preserve their images and build relationships with history through images. So this was the question that I was really interested in, especially in the context of what fueled my interest of film archiving, which was that Israel stole the Palestinian archives when they invaded in Lebanon. In the absence of this sort of national structure, well-funded structures of film archiving, what are the ways in which we can actively engage with and create image histories? And in a way, it almost, obviously, maybe to answer your question directly about where does this leave archiving, and no, I'm not like the anti-archive against film restoration or film archiving, and the big fancy film archives are amazing, and I wish I could work there, but it's also in terms of what can we create in مش بس in the absence, but also the room for experimentation and creation we have when these traditional structures do not exist. If anything, it gives us more freedom, and we have more agency that we have to sort of decide and structure on how we want to build histories through images. لا, I had one last point بس أنا نسيت. معلش.
I think this is a great time to open up for questions if anyone has any. Yeah. Back.
Hi, first of all, thank you. Is this working? I don't know. Thank you so much for that insightful talk. I have two questions. The first is, you mentioned in response to Khalid the different ways of engagement with these images and creating the culture and how it has impact. From your experiences around the world, what exact techniques worked to create that connection and action? And the second part, with seeing all the pictures you had of the protests and street art around the world for Palestine, I felt like I could see a shared identity with these people and a connection, which was uplifting in a way. But I was then thinking about the Thai film that you were mentioning and what it's like for them dealing with the censorship, or I guess how people in the diaspora, maybe think of the patterns, maybe people here can express how they feel about what's happening, whereas there they can't, and even those abroad are silenced or fear for their jobs, how they can, I guess how the people in Thailand deal with that and what we can take from it. That was very muddled, but I hope you kind of get it.
I'm very happy you asked this because it gives me an opportunity to share a really good story. The same director, actually, Daniel Huey, the Singaporean filmmaker who made the film that I think you're talking about repression, that I watched at the Thai Film Archive. It was really quite a surreal experience that I was in the cinema. We watched two of his movies. There was a discussion after, and someone raises their hand and they ask, okay, you're telling us about this sort of anti-colonial movements in Singapore in the past, but we never hear anything about anti-colonial movements in Singapore today. Can you tell us sort of about activism there? What's going on? And he says, yeah, well, it's always been kind of separated. You know, the environmental justice groups do their thing, groups interested in gender, groups interested in abolition. Each group is sort of doing their different thing. But and I'm quoting him, but in the last 3 or 4 years, things changed. And there's really been a unified political voice. And the reason is Palestine. I was obviously like, I'm shocked. يعني I'm sitting in Thailand watching a Singaporean movie, and this is sort of the discussion. Afterwards, I went and I wanted to ask him about a specific scene in a film where he's burning the physical film reel in a movie called Snakeskin, not the movie I talked about, from 2014. And I said, I fixated on this scene, sort of, why did you include this scene? And he tells me, oh, this was sort of a period that I didn't believe in images, I didn't believe in the power of images, I was kind of pessimistic. I said, oh, okay, like, what happened? It seems that you're not there now. And he said, yeah, of course I'm not there now. Have you seen what the images in Palestine have done? So it was these instances of, he doesn't know I'm Palestinian or anything, and it was very genuine what he was saying. And it's not just a question of shared identity, but it's almost a moment of recognition that people can almost find the vocabulary to understand themselves, find the frames to understand their oppression through this new sort of, these new images that are taking over in ways that this, just in terms of the Hollywood movie being the only thing that's consistent, and now the Palestinian image is also something that's consistent. It's reached a level that it's not just a question of, I think you mentioned shared identity, it's also a deep desire to build a new identity, the one that you can actually understand and interpret your present meaningfully, not simply on sort of inherited identities that are built on national levels or on familial levels, but this really deep desire to build new lineages. So I hope that answered. And then for the first question, on what techniques worked, I know this might seem reductive, but experimentation as a technique. As in, so many different techniques worked at times and did not work at other times in the same place depending on the week. But what was needed to happen is this constant re-questioning, constant self-reflection, constant sort of criticization of, are we doing what we want to be doing? And I think this experimentation is the key for any good project I've seen, whether it was working with kids and organizing film screenings, or whether it's seeing what was going on with film DJing in Tanzania. So I hope that answers.
There's one sentence he says, I think he's like, he was saying, God has given everyone the kind of creativity, so just kind of use it. Yani actually, it's fantastic.
Thank you very much for the talk. Just kind of on a very practical question, I don't know if you have come across any film photos that came out of Gaza, and if there is a role that came out of Gaza where you cannot deny that, you know, the genocide is happening, what should you do?
So, is your question if any film role came out of Gaza during this genocide,
Yes.
or if I found one?
Yes, and also if there is one, like, what would you do with it? I'm curious to hear your thoughts about this.
So I don't know if there are film reels that have been taken. I don't know, maybe someone else would be more knowledgeable than me. But it's quite a process that needs sort of, even just receiving film rolls in many places in the world is already difficult, and there are processes of developing that I'm not sure. I'd be interested if anybody knew to learn more, but I don't know of any. Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. I have multiple questions. Maybe بخليهم لبعد. But one thing that I kept thinking about throughout your entire talk is this quote that says, the eye only sees images of things that mean other things. And I know it's a bit of a mouthful, but I think it's about the symbolism of images. So on that note, I was curious to think what you think of generated images, if they have a place in an archive, if they carry the same weight as real images, since they contain fragments of reality and so on. So I just want to know more about your opinion.
I was at a conference on film a few months ago, and when the conference was about to wrap up, someone said, any questions? And someone raised their hand and said, can I just say, I'm so happy we got through this without talking about AI. فأجيت بالآخر يعني. لا 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 I'm kidding. بس لا for sure. Definitely. No, definitely. Yani, I'm trying to frame how, because I'm thinking about it now, yani, with you. I'm wondering if we think about it in terms of yani, the frameworks, in the framework of power that we're sort of talking about with Edward Said, and who sort of has this authority to create, circulate, and distribute. And also that any framework, any image that's created isn't sort of an image that can be objective on its own, but again needs to participate within already structures and narratives that exist. I think the question would become in terms of what values of truth we sort of assign to images that are created, or what's the word, genetically? I don't know anything about AI. What is generative images instead of physical images, but I think it does actually bring something very interesting, and I'll just because yani, the physical image, the whole thing I do in the sort of the beginning of the talk about the physicality of the image as sort of being a space, and this sort of, that images always have spatial forms as opposed to, for example, memories. And even in terms of the digital realm, yani if it's a big file on your laptop, it's you see when you click on its attributes, you see its size, and when your laptop runs out of memory, it runs out of space. But it's also this question of what are the spaces it's creating? I think I'm not giving you an answer. I'm just thinking about frameworks through which we can think through this question, because I don't have an answer. And that's my answer.
I have a kind of just a very brief reflection, I think, building on what you were saying. And I think in our discussion a few days ago with Ahmed, he also, I think, brought up a very, very interesting question about, why is it that kind of all of this is completely absent from, I think, the discourse on film, and why actually these cultures that we've seen throughout this isn't what we normally kind of talk about. In my opinion, actually, just watching what you were kind of talking about, I couldn't help but think that kind of we had a Western authority for the longest time, almost trying to create this synonymity between the image and reality. And in the end, photography, documentary, and whatnot. And I think, as you are doing this talk in real time and telling us, that's all a load of, lies. You have kind of deep fakes and whatnot kind of emerging at the same time. So I think that there is something very interesting that in my opinion, I think everything you established today is makes so much sense, but yet I feel there is also like there's a knowledge structure that really is trying to tell you it's not the case at all. And I think that's where really kind of the alternative mode from what you're saying, I believe, is actually maybe quite ahead of what's coming in a sense. And I think that's really for me what stuck. I don't know if you have any reflections on that, but but it's just this was very provocative and great, and I really, really appreciated it all to say. Okay. Go for it. I would like you to have the last word. I would like you to have.
I think it just goes to show the room for creation and experimentation there is when we sort of allow ourselves to break from these structures. And these histories of, these sort of imposed histories of what is film, what is the image, like you're saying, of these canonical, if we want to do a film history, we sort of have to always tie it back to European film history as a counter to that, as opposed to when we sort of draw lines and patterns across the global south, and we can draw lineages and patterns and connections amongst each other. I think this is what's so creative, what's so energizing, and what also requires so much experimentation and agency to activate these spaces, because they're not going to come from sort of traditional institutions. So,
Selma, thank you so much.
thank you. Okay. I guess building on what I just said about creating lineages. Inshallah, after Ramadan, we're going to have a study group on film manifesto. So from the 70s, the sort of revolutionary film movements that I was talking about, a big part of this culture was also creating film manifestos. So in the film manifestos, there were sort of assessments of how films, the state of films during those periods, and the interventions they wanted to make in filmmaking, distribution, screenings, and they're really quite provocative. So the proposed plan is that we create a study group to experiment with how we could create a manifesto in today's world of images, and really study what is the relationship between the image and action for us today. Inshallah, you all apply. It would be great to see you there. And yes, thank you.
Selma, thank you so much. Thank you to the audience. رمضان كريم ونشوفكم عن قريب.